Okay, my AP literature friends. So welcome to another writing workshop. Today we're going to focus on FRQ 1 from the 2021 exam, which featured Eyes, the Man with the Saxophone. And what I'll do is walk you through exactly how my students incorporated my templates to construct this essay from start to finish. So I'll show you a number of introductory paragraphs where the students employed my template. And then we'll take a look at a few couple body paragraphs as well. So we'll take a look at how the students used the inverted thesis for some introductions, and how the template constructs meaning for those introductory paragraphs. And then we'll take a look at a couple of body paragraphs where the students used my technique that I call the syllogistic method. So without further ado, let's get into this. So one of the things I always emphasize with teachers that take my mastermind, or if I push into two departments or districts to introduce my templates to them, I always emphasize the following idea, that you have to Bob Ross your instruction. And what I mean by that is this. You're going to notice here in a second that I provide a lot of exemplars and models when I teach. And when I'm working with my students, I position myself as the expert writer in the classroom. So they see me write a lot, especially early in the academic year as they're learning these templates. I may say to them, all right, guys, when we perform literary analysis, the only thing you can ever do is invert the thesis. We've been studying some poems. Here's 5 examples of introductions based on some of the poems that we've read. Okay, you've seen me do it 5 times. Now you write your own. And it demystifies the writing process for them. If they see a lot of good writing, and even the good, the bad, the ugly, you kind of want to show them some snafus and pitfalls as well. And over time, after they've seen enough good writing, they in turn can produce good writing. It's kind of like this. If we were students of Bob Ross, and he were to come onto the screen and say, hello, happy little people. Today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge, right? He doesn't say, deuces, here's a graphic organizer to fill out. You got 2 class periods to figure it out. On your mark, get set, go. I'm going to mill around the room to make sure there's no classroom management issues. No, he sits there at the canvas and paints with us. And even if we are so inept that we could barely hold a paintbrush, we can closely approximate what Bob Ross is doing on the canvas by following his lead. And the same can be said of our students. Over time, if we were to paint with Bob Ross a lot and were, very dutiful students and pupils of his, we'd become quite adept at painting. And the same is true for our students. They position themselves behind us. We show them some templates, we use some heuristics with them, and off they go. And I'll close my Bob Ross analogy here by saying he only used one heuristic. In composition, we typically refer to that as a template. And his was the wet on wet technique. So every masterpiece that guy ever created, he used one technique. And for my students, they're going to use 2 templates, one for the introduction and one for the body paragraph. And no matter the expository mode, whether it be literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, all they ever have to do is employ these 2 templates. They just need to know what expository mode they're writing in. So here's the prompt for the 2021 FRQ1. I'll read it to you. In I's poem, The Man with the Saxophone, published in 1985, the speaker encounters a man playing a saxophone. Read the poem carefully. Then in a well-written essay, analyze how I uses literary elements and techniques to convey the complexity of the speaker's encounter with the saxophone player at that particular time and place. This is a pretty standard prompt. There's no curveball in this. It sets the kids up, if they adhere to the prompt, to perform literary analysis, and that's the demand of the assignment. So when I look at prompts like that, and I do this with all College Board prompts, even the language exam for rhetorical analysis, um, I find there to be two implicit questions in every single prompt. Even the assignments that I make, the literary analysis assignments I make for my students, have two implicit questions in them. The first is, what is the authorial intent? And the second one is, how does the author construct meaning? And in order to get a real good hardcore thesis, both of those questions need to be answered. So, what is the authorial intent? And how does the author construct meaning? So the question becomes, how do I construct the introductory paragraph? If I have those two questions I have to respond to and the prompt, because we can't write, regardless of the prompt, how do I construct the introductory paragraph? Here's the kicker. My kids know two ways to do it. They can declare the thesis or they can invert the thesis. So let's start with declaring. So look at this triangle here, upside right, the musical triangle. So when you declare, you start with your thesis. Just out of the gate, boom, drop your thesis, and the rest is context and background. And something that I have my students focus on right out of the gate is their tier 2 level vocabulary. I like to see my students establish an academic tone. So by tier 2, I just mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber word. And then sentence constructs. One of the things I teach in my mastermind and when I consult is I borrowed it from Strunk and White, their manual called Write It Right. They assert that there are 12 different ways to write a sentence. So you take one sentence, I could show you a revision of it 12 different ways. There's 12 different sentence constructs. My students are very well versed in manipulating their sentence constructs in order to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow. I incorporate that into these little mini academies that we have early in the academic year to break them away from the over-reliance of the short, simple declarative sentence. I'm sure when you've read student work, especially you're struggling and emerging writers, they go short, simple declarative, short, simple declarative, short, simple declarative, and you have that chop, 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 chop rhythm throughout the piece. So my students can manipulate their syntax pretty well, most of them. So here's the thing, though. The declarative, I find, is best for rhetorical analysis, and then for synthesis, persuasion, and argument, it's a 50-50 flip between declarative and inverted. For the purposes of literary analysis, I always have my students invert, and here's what I mean by that. So you start with context and background, and by that, you're answering the question, what is the authorial intent? As you whittle it down towards the thesis, the last sentence is going to be the thesis statement, right? Because you're inverting. And the thesis statement is going to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? So here's another kicker on this. Every introductory body paragraph that my students write are going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less, exactly 4 sentences long. So I like them to get out of the gate strong. I want them to make a fantastic first impression. And I want the College Board readers to say, all right, this kid's got some spunk. This kid's got some pizzazz and some chops. I think they're going to get the style point, right out of the gate. So I want my guys to crush it. I know that a lot of teachers advise their kids to do the 1-sentence introduction. I'm fine with that, because all they do is get the thesis point, but I just don't think it's as skillful a way. There's more skillful ways to do it than that. So here is an example of an inverted thesis. So the very first question is, what is the authorial intent? And if we reflect back upon I's poem, The Man with the Saxophone, the very first sentence is going to be a real tight synopsis of what the whole poem means. What is the authorial intent? So let me read this to you. Some people find themselves blessed when they finally come to see beautiful things in humbly unexpected places. Ka-ching, that's like the whole poem. So now we're just going to flesh that out for 2 more sentences. While others look upon these exact spots in time and space and see nothing, a rare man can find the ethereal and divine. Juxtaposing the narrator's bleak humanness to the city's gradual early morning awakening, I conveys the transformation of his protagonist from his dark existence to his becoming one with an almost internal state of nirvana. The last sentence is going to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? So here we want to see the use of the literary terms and or devices. So you focus on the most prominent ones, like what are the ones that create the meaning? Through these motifs and the personification of the city and symbols of rebirth and rejuvenation, I suggest that one can find the eternal joys of life in its utter simplicity. So you can see here, it's got good rhythm and flow. The sentence constructs are very, very well constructed. Definitely has some nice tier 2 to it without being, I tell my guys, don't get out of your wheelhouse with the vocab. The idea is, some students have this notion that the bigger the words they use, like if they just use $1 million words, it's equivalent to good writing, and they need to be disabused of that. So this one, it's good. It has some nice tier 2 level vocabulary, but the kid owns the words, right? So sometimes when we ask students to stretch, they misfire their words and they take them out of context, or they just don't have full possession of the meaning of that word. And it's just kind of a miscue. So I'll show you a couple more that are going to follow the exact same template. So here's a different student one. What is the authorial intent? Right out of the gate, answer that question. One can say that deep human connection is the purpose and essence of having a meaningful life. Again, that's the whole gist of the poem. So give some context and background around that. Further, once a person comes to this understanding of how to interact with life at this exact purpose, the most amazing acts of love, humanness, and generosity can arise. Sometimes in the hustle and bustle of life, we need a reminder to slow down just long enough to see the value of humanity's beauty and appreciate what it is to just be alive in this space and time. So it's a beautiful synopsis of the poem. Takes 3 sentences. 4th sentence, how does the author construct meaning? Drop your terms and devices. I conveys this message through the juxtaposition of the awakening city and the spiritual awakening of his narrator through the symbol of rebirth and personal growth. Followed the exact same template. First 3 sentences, context, background, answering the question, what is the authorial intent? So you see you're going to have a heavy thematic focus when you answer that question. And then the last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? Like what terms and devices does he use in order to get to his authorial intent? Here's one more. Same thing. What is the authorial intent? Music is one of the most predominant things that can yield a catharsis. While self-inflicted misery and pure joyfulness can be intensely attractive states of being on their own, when the two live side by side, great moments can be created while paradoxically negating the former. Personal growth can sometimes spark from the nowhere of unexpected places, but when one finds themselves on the threshold of obtaining a state of heightened awareness from a seemingly trite thing such as a corner musician, the effect can be beyond profound. Again, that took 3 sentences. What is the authorial intent? Tier 2, sentence constructs, context, background. Last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? And this is going to be the thesis statement. I arrives at this idea through the personification of the city landscape and the allusions to higher spiritual principles. So I'm going to anticipate something that some of you may be thinking or feeling at this point in time. You might say, yes, but Christian, I don't want my students using or dropping the literary terms and or devices in the introduction. I want them to hold off on those for the topic sentences in the body paragraph. And you are right. there's two ways to do this. There's two ways to skin this fish. So I know some teachers prefer to have the terms and devices in the thesis statement, and others want to hold off on them until the topic sentences. And in a second, you'll see I call that the first premise. So my students can do this in two ways. Way number one, like I just showed you, I really like my struggling and emerging students to use this particular template because it ensures that they have a thesis statement. No matter how much I practice and how much assigning that I give, I still have students that just systematically want to perform plot synopsis or plot analysis. Their papers read like Cliff Note synopses instead of literary analysis. So to ensure that they are meeting the demands of the assignment, if that last sentence has the terms and devices, and of course you got to read the passage correctly, you get the thesis point, and that's half the battle. But you can arrive at a thesis without using the terms and devices. So I'm going to demonstrate that with a different poem, one that we've probably all taught in AP Lit at some point in time, or at least we're all familiar with it. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, Sonnet 130. So again, you can invert the thesis. It's going to be 4 sentences long, and you're going to answer the question, what is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning minus the terms and devices? You still can answer that question, but withhold the terms and or devices. So here's an example of one. First sentence, what is the authorial intent? Giving voice to one's love is such a tricky thing to do given its subjectivity. And for those of you that have read this sonnet, that's the whole gist of it. That's exactly what Shakespeare is trying to hammer home. So now let's give some context and background to substantiate that a little bit. It's as if words simply cannot convey the magnitude of the feeling. So what we do is resort to comparisons, often to the natural world. Poets have been doing this for centuries while elevating their mistresses to ethereal deities. So look at the last sentence here. Just get the lit terms out. You don't need them there in order to arrive at a thesis. So Shakespeare, on the other hand, brings his girl back to earth and humanizes her while nonetheless expressing his genuine love for her. So with this particular poem, we were working on the pizzazz and the wow factor. And I was telling my students, like, sometimes you can use some colloquial and vernacular just to be spunky, like you're 17 years old, be academic, but be you. And I really liked how this student said, brings his girl back to earth and humanizes her. I thought that was a nice flair to it. So you'll see my students sometimes drop a little colloquial and vernacular to balance out the academic, and I think that's good for voice. So here's another one, exact same template. It's going to omit the terms though. When language is rendered ineffable, we often resort to analogies in the hopes that comparisons can get our point across. And again, that's the big ka-ching. That's exactly what Shakespeare is doing. This is often the case when we try to give voice to love. Love is such an unwieldy thing that it's like counting every grain of sand on a long stretch of beach. But Shakespeare does not go the route of false comparisons. He instead expresses his love plainly. So again, that's the thesis statement in the last sentence. So all of these are inverted. All 6 that we've seen so far follow that inverted template. And the thesis comes last. 4 sentences, sentence constructs, tier 2. Here's one last one from a super, super, super concrete writer. But you can see what they can do within the the confine of the template. When our words fail us, we are reduced to doing things like pantomiming and gesticulating. But poets are craftier than this. They hyperbolize. But instead of being like all of his contemporaries, Shakespeare renders his lover in very grounding and humanistic language. So it doesn't even really need to be that, pizzazzy, This is good nuts and bolts. Thesis. The writing isn't superb. It doesn't blow me away, but it's still a good start. This kid has a good foundation upon which to write the whole rest of his essay. And out of the gates, it's not blazing start, but it's definitely a good start. If they can continue this and the rest of their essay, it's going to bode well for them. So let's do this. Body paragraphs. Some of you are familiar with my syllogistic method, and some of you, this is your first orientation to it. So I'll give a brief background on it, and just know that if you want more on this, I have other videos on YouTube. I offer my mastermind class. And if you want to know more about that, then you can look at www.teachinghow2write.com, and you can email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And I have a lot of resources I'm always willing to share, so I love doing this. So here's the syllogistic method in a nutshell. It comes from the Aristotelian tradition. So Aristotle thunked this up back in the day, and he ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn polemics, oration, the math, science, art of debate. And I don't know if you guys have ever read something like Plato's Republic, where the essential question of what is justice is thrown out, and then all of the philosophical thinkheads of the time pontificate on what is justice. Each time, one of the philosophers utters his response to the question, what is justice, it's articulated in syllogistic form, and then they word wrangle that and ultimately refute it, dispute it, tear it apart. And then the next philosopher comes to the mic and says, I have a new definition of what is justice. And Aristotle said, some of my students are really, really good at debate, and some of my students are, some of my kids just always tank bomb and lose their debates. Did God come around on his gravy train and say, Jason's going to be God's gift to oration, and Peter's going to be, okay, bat 50-50, and Michael's just going to tank bomb it every single time? And he said, no, I can't believe that. I'm a teacher. I have to believe that all of my students can learn. So what he did over time was study what the really good orators do, and he had a eureka moment, and he said, aha, I got it. The real good thinkers think syllogistically. And here's what he meant by that. It's when you argue from premise to conclusion, right? So the College Board talks about line of reasoning. I refer to it as cogency with my students, like be supremely logical. Like that's what happens when you walk a tight line of reasoning or you're cogent. So saying things like this, right? Having bulletproof arguments like this. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So you want to be very absolutely logical when you write, because good writing is good thinking. That's pretty much where our students are going to go awry, is in their thinking. So sometimes we read papers, we scratch our heads and say, where is this going? That got really wayward quickly. So they bring in extraneous things. They don't draw their conclusions. And at some point in time, I could do a webinar on this or do a video. If we take a look at College Board sample papers, I could demonstrate for you that what most kids in the nation are doing is only presenting a second premise. And that's why so many of these anchor papers appear so plot heavy. They read like cliff notes to me, and it's because they're only offering forth the second premise, but I can get into that at another time. So in terms of performing literary analysis, this is how the syllogism is going to work. So the first premise is going to be a statement that contains a term or device. And again, this is one of the reasons why my students withhold the terms, because they can get redundant to have them in the last sentence of the thesis in the introduction, and then the first sentence of the body paragraph also has terms. It sounds a little redundant. So my students typically go the route of the introductions that look like "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." So again, it's a debate. We're like 50-50 split down the seams on that. I just think withholding them and then holding them or placing them in the first premise tends to be a little bit more sophisticated, and I'll show you that in just a second. The second premise is going to be textual support, and it's the teeter-totter balance between quoting and paraphrasing. And the conclusion is the textual analysis. And I always tell my kids that the first premise is a promise. In the conclusion, you want to be shaking hands back to your premise, saying, "Aha, I kept my promise. We're good. Like, the argument's done. We can walk on." So students often ask me this, since we're using templates: "Mr. Kuhn, the introduction is always going to be 4 sentences long. How many sentences should a syllogistic body paragraph be?" And I say, in order to have enough support and analysis in there, you should be shooting for 10 sentences. All right, that's kind of the magic number, 10. And I hard cap them at 12. If they go beyond 12, they're just bloviating and going on bird walks and probably bringing in all this extraneous stuff, or they get super plot heavy. And we don't want that. So this keeps them really focused and logical, hopefully, line of reasoning. So here's the kicker. A couple of things to keep in mind. Students often ask this: where do I begin my analysis? And I tell them, start where the poet starts. So you see the transition here, right from the onset of the poem. So start where I starts. All right, start where Shakespeare starts. And you proceed through it chronologically and sequentially. This is one little trick that I have that helps my students sustain their line of reasoning. You have to have some kind of sequence, some kind of logic in the progression of the analysis in order to help them have that line of reasoning. The other thing too that you're going to see is the first premise is always going to be 3 sentences long with my template. And here's the reason why. With the synthesis exam on the language, with FRQ1 for the AP language exam, the College Board says your argument must be central a few times. And all expository writing is an act of arguing. And I think sometimes students and maybe even teachers forget that. In this first premise, I want to hear an argument where the student is using their terms and devices to make that argument. And here's the other thing. Students need to be able to see how the pieces construct the meaning of the work as a whole. So if they just have a singular topic sentence, this is what's going to happen. They do one paragraph tone, another paragraph diction, another paragraph syntax, another paragraph metaphor, etc. So it ends up being like an 11-paragraph essay. But as we know, it's never that long because they run out of time or they run out of stamina, and then therefore the read is incomplete. In taking 3 sentences, the argument stays central, but they also can multitask the terms and devices. They can link something like tone to syntax to conflict, right? They can link theme to a juxtaposition and an allusion. So like see how the pieces interconnect with each other and interlock like a jigsaw. So take a look at this one here and see how the terms are multitasking and speaking to each other. Right from the onset of the poem, I sets up his main theme, that sometimes the biggest epiphanies arise from seemingly insignificant things. Through personifying certain aspects of the city, he creates the central juxtaposition of the narrator's transformation from a state of bleakness to a state of what is almost a divine place of spirituality. Alluding to a variety of theologies, I arrives at how one can attain a heightened awareness of their humanness. So you can see there's a few terms in there, right? You got a few terms, few devices. Now, as I said just a second ago, this first premise is a promise. So let's see here. I promised you that I'm going to look at the theme, the juxtaposition, and the allusion. If there is to be a line of reasoning, a clearly established line of reasoning, those three things must be addressed. So as we move into the second premise, all of the quotes, all the paraphrasing needs to be germane to those three things in order for there to be cogency. So let's see what they do here. Second premise begins the fourth sentence, and I tell my students immediately get into the text. Let's start quoting. All right. So here it is. From the beginning of the poem, we are told that it is 5 a.m. and that the streets are empty, but as the city gradually awakens, the manhole covers seem alive, and the white hair that bearded the face of the city is brittle and unrecognizable. So let's talk about this. Quote transitions need to be smooth. And I have a simple way to do this. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum, so not exactly, a minimum of 5 words in front of a quote and keeps the quote small, you should sound conversational. And that's what we want. That's embedding, like, real good, solid embedding. But you can see here, I have 4 quotes in one sentence. Wholly complex. Right? So if you're going for the sophistication point, that's something to keep in mind. I like it when my students can do this from time to time, not every time they quote, but from time to time. It shows a level of complexity, and a lot of students are not able to do that. Like when I read anchor papers, I don't see a lot of kids in the nation doing that, that skillfully and that tactfully. So it's just something that can be taught. You Bob Ross it enough, they'll be able to do it for you. So, all right, so far our line of reasoning is good. That quote is germane to what we were talking about in the first premise. The portrayal of this personified landscape can be juxtaposed to the eventual awakening of the narrator. In a sense, he's asleep because at this stage of his amble, he is earthbound and solitude is his companion. So again, keep everything conversational. So you got to have enough support and enough analysis. We have 3 terms and devices at play up top in the first premise. We have to substantiate that and prove that with enough textual analysis. So let's keep going here. Defeated by life and apparently forlorn, he insists that we don't try to tell him otherwise. He's had it all and lost it and never wants it back. All right, we're perfect. So it's this 1-2 punch of quote, paraphrase, support, analysis, and you just keep doing that in the second premise. Just weave that all together. Life can, oops, I went too far. Life can pummel us into such a submission. Sometimes we find ourselves wondering the possibilities of turning ourselves into a bird like the shaman we are meant to be, but our negative and fixed mindsets get in the way. So you see my students bracket a little bit as well to keep it conversational, so that's been taught to them. But sometimes something comes along to sweep us off our feet. The mind can empty like the Buddhists tell you is possible if only you don't try, and you can find yourself mercifully opening into the unforgiving new day. A mere man with a saxophone can do this. Such a man in such a moment can transform one into the unencumbered bird of imagination. So let's go back here. Have we kept our promise? Absolutely. We've talked about theme, juxtaposition, and allusion. We've talked about nothing else. All the paraphrasing, all the quoting is super linked to that promise. So now we're at the conclusion of the syllogism. We have to bring it full circle. So in this, we should echo the thesis statement, right? Link it back to the thesis and keep the promise of the first premise. This conclusion typically takes 2 to 3 sentences. The manner in which the poem ends brings the transformation full circle in that the notes of the musician are compared to a black flower, a symbol of rebirth and rejuvenation. The narrator, bleak and forlorn at the crack of dawn, awakens just as the city does into a new state of being that is divine in nature. This transformation arises from simplicity, a simplicity that usually accompanies such an epiphany. And that's it. So I think that took 11 sentences. There's plenty of support and plenty of analysis to fully prove the argument that was dropped in the first premise. I stayed cogent. There's definitely a line of reasoning. There's a sophistication to this. There's a voice, there's a rhythm, and a flow that is going to bode very well for our writers if they can do this in May come time for the exam. So that is a very brief overview of what a syllogistic body paragraph looks like. So I encourage you, try your hand at Bob Rossing your instructions. So write a few examples, models for your students and see how they do. So again, if you want more information about any of my courses that I offer or any other resources, you can visit that website there, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. So I do a lot of PD, small group in the mastermind. We usually have like five teachers at a time in that. And, come check it out at the webpage if you're interested in working with me for a little professional development. So hopefully you found this to be useful and can use it in your classroom. For now, happy teaching and happy writing, and I'll see you in the next video.